Good morning, everybody who's joining now. See the attendee list is kicking up. We're at 300 already, so welcome. We'll give everybody a couple of minutes to join before we get started, so make yourselves comfortable. And thank you for joining us. You can see on the screen the panelists for today, so take that in. Okay, I think it's time to get started. So thank you everybody for joining. I know that the number will continue to grow. So thank you all for joining us today for the second webinar here, which is obviously being designed to develop the tourism recovery plan. I want to kick off the session by introducing and inviting Sisa Ntshona, the CEO of SA Tourism, who's going to provide an overview of why we're running the webinars, and also some background and context on the current situation. So Sisa, over to you.
Thank you, John, and good day, everybody. And thank you very much again for showing such keen interest and contributing towards this recovery plan. I must say I was quite positively surprised at the level of interaction, views and thoughts that all of you contributed and participated in. And I really want to encourage you as well, please don't stop. You are part of the sector. We do value your views and contributions in taking us forward. Just to kind of reiterate, we are hosting these webinars as part of building a recovery plan for the sector that will ultimately give a blueprint, for tourism within South Africa and working through the current pandemic that we're in. We do know and understand that right now we are literally in the dark and there's pain that's being felt by the sector, but we want to offer some point of view further down the line as to how things can look and change. I think first and foremost, I want to say thank you very much to all the panelists that have agreed to join and offer their views. I really, really value your time and your contribution. And thank you for allowing me to lean on you guys to say, well, please pop your head up and actually give us your view as well. It's important to note, and I say to all the participants, the panelists have gracefully agreed to share their thoughts. Please let's not engage them on one-on-one commercial issues that may between your businesses and them as well. They're here as part of a panel that's been invited to share views and thoughts. I think any specific issues, please take them offline, and those can be, picked up on a one-on-one basis. I kind of got the sense that in terms of our previous webinar, there were specific questions or issues that a lot of you had, and I do encourage you, please pick those through the normal channels and information. John, I want to say thank you again for being a grand host, if I put it that way, and really kind of bringing everyone together and make sure that everyone is heard. I'm just going to spend a couple of moments just to talk about the last webinar. We got questions in the chat. We went through all of them and certain themes came up, and I just want to quickly rush through them and kind of give you a bit of responses in terms of some of the views. The first one, there was a lot of questions around the Tourism Relief Fund. The 200 million that was announced by the Department of Tourism to alleviate the sector and everything else there. The Department of Tourism is the custodian of the Tourism Relief Fund, and they're the ones who actually manage it, the criteria and everything else there. And I would encourage you, please go to the website, www.tourism.gov.za. You'll find all the information that is there, all the information how to contact the call center, the criteria that's required, and everything else that you may require. www.tourism.gov.za. That is the official website of the Department of Tourism. Of course, if any issues are raised there, I will take those and pass them on to the department, and they will deal with the detail from their perspective. You'll also notice that there are no associations that have been invited as panel members. And some people have been asking me, what about this association, that association? First of all, the associations themselves are represented ultimately through the TBCSA, the Tourism Business Council of South Africa, which is actually an association of associations. The minister meets with TBCSA and its board and members on a regular basis. For instance, last week, where all of the panel of all the members of TBCSA represented on there had an opportunity and a view to input their views to the minister and everything else. I also listen in on those conversations and make sure that everything is included. So there again, here's an opportunity to be able to submit your information through your various associations so that they actually get the attention of the principals that are required there. I also got asked the question, where is the minister, where is government, etc. Just to remind everyone that South African tourism is government in itself. So we are here on the mandate of the Minister of Tourism to say engage the sector. Broadly speaking, the Department of Tourism is dealing with everyday matters relating to the crisis, right? Things around quarantine sites, things around the tourism relief fund is being dealt through with the department. SA Tourism has been given the opportunity to say, well, look through the cycle and give us a view for post-recovery. And that's how we're straddling between the two, because I got some views that some of you say, well, is this the right time to be speaking about recovery? Should we not be focusing on the crisis itself? Fair comment. And that's where we kind of split the responsibilities and say, department, you look at the right now crisis, how do we navigate ourselves on a daily basis to make sure we've got a sector to speak of? SA Tourism start looking through the cycle and saying, how do we start to put together a recovery plan? And this is part of the process. There is also the provincial tourism authorities. Each province in this country has a tourism body. Please engage with them. Make sure your views and thoughts and everything else that may be specific to the province are also driven through there. Again, please find that information for each province so that we can be contributed on that side. And then last but not least, when the last time we had this webinar last Thursday, a lot has changed from then to now. The lockdown has been extended by a further 2 weeks. That has a trickle-down effect. And I'd like to hear some of the conversations as to how long is this pandemic and what does recovery look like as well. I'm sure most of you would have plugged in yesterday to the Minister of Health, who I think gave a very comprehensive view. And then more than anything, kind of took us into his confidence as to how they get to the decisions that they get to. And certainly for me, it was enlightening to really get some form of comfort that there's methodology behind the decisions that are made, but also took us into confidence that we all have a role to play together in make sure that we are holding forth. So therefore, it gives a sense that the sacrifices that we've been asked to endure right now, right, are actually will pay us dividends further down the line. And I know that may seem a bit stiffened at the moment, with everything that's going on, but we've got to nail this thing down so that we can have a sector to speak of after that. I also got a note from our office in France this morning, as an example, that France has also extended the lockdown to 11 May. Again, you see the dynamism starting to happen around there. If our source markets are also delaying, also in trouble, then it impacts our recovery plan, because then the timing of this becomes quite an issue. So again, there's a lot of things going on at the same time. And again, it's to tease all this information through. I encourage you that besides the panelists that are here, you also have a voice. Please click on the chat. If you have specific questions to address to a particular member, I'm sure John will take you through in terms of how you can address something to the particular member. But again, I want to stress again, please let's not discuss commercial issues that are private and confidential in their nature, but broad concepts around the sector. We're happy to engage the different companies post this and talk about whatever particular issues here. So I say they are brave because I know there may be a lot of questions posed to them, but I've given them my assurance I will protect them if need be. But today is about sharing of views and insights. And you also as well, participants, absolutely encouraged. And I want to hand over back to John so that we can get started. And thank you for indulging me.
Many thanks, Sisa. Thanks once again to everybody. We've got over 1,700 people now on the webinar, so thank you all for taking the time to join the webinar. For those of you in the audience who do know me, for those of you who don't, please allow me to just quickly introduce myself. I'm the CEO and founder of Aviadev Africa, which is Africa's largest air service development event. Ultimately, what we're trying to do is increase air connectivity to, from, but most importantly, intra-African. And the 2018 and 2019 events were both hosted by Wesgro and the Cape Town Air Access team in Cape Town. So obviously I have a long-term affinity with South Africa, and I'm delighted to be able to be here with you today. So before we get into the session, what I wanted to share with you all, for those of you who haven't been on the webinar before, is just the housekeeping rules for you all. So to let you know, only the panelists have the ability to use their microphones during today's webinar. So if you do want to make an interjection, if you want to ask a question, there is a Q&A button at the bottom of your screen, or obviously on the app if you're using the mobile phone. You can ask questions at any point. They will all be logged, and we'll try to get to them either today, or we'll be covering them with some of the questions today, or in the coming days. There is another webinar on Thursday. And after the webinar, the recording will be uploaded to YouTube, and all of you will receive an email with the link to obviously have a listen. Now, before we start, what I would like to do is actually run a quick poll for all of you out there, just to get your feelings on where we stand right now. So I'm about to launch this. We'll leave this open for about 1 minute. If you can start voting. So when do you think that tourism in South Africa will return to 2019 levels? I see the votes coming in now. So if you can all cast your votes nice and quick for up to a couple of hundred, it'd be nice to just get so we can set the agenda for today. Okay, I'll give it another 20 seconds or so. Well, we've had well over 1,000 votes, so that's fantastic. Okay, and I will share the results with you all now. So there you go. So the majority of people are saying early next year or towards the end of next year. We have some people, outliers there, saying after 2022. So that's great to get a nice feel for where we stand. So what I would like to do now is I'd like to get on with the panel, and what I will do is I'll introduce each panelist one by one, and obviously start with a question for them. Now, each one's obviously got vast experience in the tourism industry here in South Africa. So I want to start with Michael Tollman. Michael is the CEO of Cullinan Holdings, a holding company operating multiple inbound and outbound tour operators, and a lot more besides. He's got over 30 years experience in the travel sector. Now, Michael, as an organization with both local and global operations, how is South Africa faring in comparison to other countries where you've got operations? And what can we learn from other parts of the globe that you think can be implemented in South Africa?
Hi, John. Thank you. Good morning, everybody. Well, firstly, our businesses in South Africa are spread across various tourism businesses, and our global business, the Travel Corporation, is spread over 40 offices around the world. And this year, we were celebrating our 100-year centenary as a travel and leisure group. So unfortunately, this is not the way we plan to celebrate 2020. For us, and I think the advantage for me was I've really been involved in this since January. We have offices in China, Asia, and really across the world, and I have been in regular calls with our various offices. I've seen the despair in China, Singapore, and I've seen the other side, how quickly Singapore got to grips with things and recovered. And now, of course, it's got a new set of problems for various other reasons. So there have been many lessons that we've learned along the way. I was in a meeting about 10 days, 2 weeks before the emergency was declared with the industry and our minister. And I think I was the only person in the room who suggested that we stop flights from high-risk countries in order to protect the rest of the market. And I think the reason for me being able to see that is I was dealing with it then around our offices, and I could see what was coming. Perhaps everybody could see it, but maybe I could just see it a little closer. So I think that's really, if I look at around having the advantage of discussing and getting the input of people around the world, and a business that has been in tourism for 100 years, that has dealt with so many different crises. I think to summarize it, what I've learned and seen over this past few months, and I've certainly become more experienced than I ever wanted to, was that this is no crisis like we've ever seen. It's affected everybody across the board, no matter how big you are, small, in any way. But we remain optimistic, and we believe it's important, and we are looking at June to start across the world in tours across the country operating, hotels to open again as soon as possible, and we're already taking bookings going forward. So if I said in summary, what have we learned? We've learned really that, and this is both from our customers and what's out there, is that there's huge demand. Our problem is not one of demand. It's massively pent up. And I think we've all discussed it's probably going to start off with domestic, regional, and international. Our problem is confidence, both confidence to travel from a health perspective, but also psychologically. The psychological confidence to be in areas where their spatial distances may be tighter than we're comfortable with, i.e. airports and aircraft. And I think now we're at the stage where companies, airlines, businesses, like all of us, are looking forward. And that's what's amazing, Sisa, about these webinars and what you're doing to try to look forward and say, how do we prepare for that? And companies around the world are doing that. Delta Airlines has just come out with new ways of dealing with these issues. Our companies themselves have always been and focused on our customers, hygiene, and so on, but are really looking how we can extend that to make people feel comfortable. Our coaches, we're looking at the same thing and what things we can add to. So confidence is really our issue. We believe that May is going to be a crucial time for this country and for our businesses. And the reason is, if you take firstly from a job perspective and company perspective, and you look at the reports, US reports from auditors, information we have with our customers, we have probably a lot of companies have 60 days of working capital. And probably by May, they're going to come under pressure. As well, companies that don't have the resources or financial support to have access to. So May is going to be a very critical time. From the government's perspective, I think also May is a critical time. Is this the beginning of the curve, or is it the end and we've escaped it by getting in early? So all of these things are going to have an impact on where we end up in May. And from our perspective, and with our experience that we have, we do believe and we have faith in the fact that the world is looking at these different technological health resolutions to these things and testing and improving. And we've come so far in the last 5 weeks. We believe the next 5 weeks will be 6 weeks or more will be telling. So really May is where we think we'll have a better position. And overall as a company, we are planning to be operating from June. May, June this year. So we take an optimistic view to getting back and getting in there. And we think it's critical that companies get back in and start the process, obviously domestically first. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Michael. And yeah, confidence, optimism, short horizons as well. I think, you know, building confidence is something that we definitely need to talk about and how to do that. As you discussed. So I want to bring Velma into the conversation now. So Velma is the manager of Sub-Saharan Africa at Airbnb. She has over 15 years of international experience in both business-to-business and business-to-consumer businesses across tech, tourism, and creative industries, including heading the marketing division at Cape Town Tourism as well. So let's start by talking about Airbnb. Of course, it's hugely impacted by the current situation just because of its business model. And I saw that initially the platform allowed guests to cancel for free, which looks after the guest, but not necessarily the host. But I believe that's kind of changed? And obviously we'll have people on this webinar who are hosts, who are considering that, whatever it may be. And I believe that there's some sort of relief fund. So can you give us a little bit more detail on how Airbnb see this and how it's impacted your operation?
Yes, thank you, John. And good afternoon to everyone who's on the line here. Even though, you know, I can't see your faces, I mean, I've seen in the comments that we have people from Kokstad, St. Lucia, Dinakang. I even saw that there's someone from Nigeria on the line. You know, it's a really, you know, wonderful to be part of such a community, you know, of people who, you know, are so heavily invested in tourism. So, yes, John, you're absolutely, you know, correct. Airbnb has been very much impacted. I think if I had 10 Rand for every time I've heard the word unprecedented, you know, in the last few weeks, I would be a very rich woman. And, you know, these are absolutely, you know, unprecedented times for Airbnb too. Similarly, you know, to, you know, what we've seen, what Michael was saying, you know, we saw, you know, first kind of the impacts in China and then, you know, moving to Italy and kind of, you know, around Europe. And our first priority has been very much around the health of our teams and our community. So I think, you know, we've really acted quickly and decisively to ensure, you know, the safety of our community and trying to balance the very, very complex needs of a two-sided marketplace, you know, as you alluded to. Like a lot of other companies, I think we started to think of this crisis in phases. So the first phase is sort of triage and containment, then moving to a pivot phase, which is probably what, you know, Michael was referring to kind of in May, June, then starting to look at kind of pre-recovery and then recovery. Right now, though, we're very much in what we would consider the triage and containment phase. And that has been, you know, focused on kind of the health and the safety of our community. So the kinds of things that we've looked at doing was first, you know, we needed to move all of our employees to working from home, including a number of our call centers who weren't capacitated to work from home at the same time as which, you know, the World Health Organization announced this pandemic. So you can imagine that there was a lot of traffic coming to kind of call centers. The second thing was that when the World Health Organization announced this a pandemic, we rolled out what we call the Global Extenuating Circumstances Policy, which basically said that anyone, anywhere who was traveling, you know, during a certain period of time could cancel and get a full refund based on COVID. And the reason why we did this was that we wanted to keep people safe. We didn't feel that anybody should feel compelled to travel because they were worried that they were going to lose money. However, you know, as we say, you know, and so that definitely favored the guests. It also had a huge impact on our hosts, and this is the kind of the balancing the two-sided marketplace, as a lot of our hosts, you know, while Airbnb took no fees on that, a lot of those refunds had to come completely from our hosts. So we have subsequently changed some of the parameters around the extenuating circumstances policy, but we've also announced a 250 million host relief fund, which means that any hosts that were impacted by the global EC policy will stand to get 25% of their cancellation policy. We've also rolled out a super host fund, which has been funded exclusively through our founders and Airbnb employees. It started at 10 million. It's now gone up to $20 million US. And then there's also, you know, there's been a huge amount of work done with kind of governments across the world, making sure that our hosts and guests are able to have managed to get all the right information pertaining to lockdowns and what that means as governments are starting to close borders. Also ensuring that our hosts, many of those who are sole proprietors or, you know, entrepreneurs or self-employed, can stand to benefit from some of the relief packages that have been announced. And then I think just two kind of, you know, last things that I wanted to mention was, the first was that one of the things that's absolutely been astonishing for me as we go through this crisis is the generosity that I've seen. And this is not something that is specific to Airbnb. I think we've seen it in all aspects of this, the tourism industry, of people wanting to contribute positively to the crisis. So what we had launched was, and this came from initially from our hosts in Italy, a program called Frontline Stays, which was hosts on Airbnb offering their accommodation, either for free or very, very discounted rates for frontline workers, so doctors and nurses that were, working in relief efforts. And this has now been rolled out. We did it in partnership with the Ministry of Health in France, as well as the NHS in the UK and a number of other countries. And then in listening, one of the things that we also did as we kind of came through this phase is that we paused our experiences product, because experiences are, so much based on like one-on-one interaction. We didn't think that it made sense. But in listening to our experiences hosts, they all said, are there other ways that we can continue to earn income? And so last week we launched online experiences on Airbnb, which is an opportunity to do the same experiences, but just online. I actually did one yesterday with my daughter, which was a cooking experience with a host in San Francisco. And, we had people from Italy, the UK, France, joining us on that experience. I think we're optimistic, that travel will bounce back. Travel is very resilient. It's just a matter of when and how. And I think from our perspective is that Airbnb is uniquely placed, that we are able to, whatever the scenario is, I think we'll be able to, we're flexible enough to be able to accommodate the trends. So whether it is longer term stays, domestic travel, very kind of near term, very hyper local experiences. And I think the benefit of a platform like Airbnb is that the ability of it to put back money into the pockets of locals, who either, whether it's, through sharing a space in your home, or whether it's through, hosting an experience, which is going to be very much needed, especially as we think about how we're going to come through this economic downturn.
Yeah, thank you, Velma. And I think the virtual experience is something that I know SA Tourism has done, Robben Island and other amazing landmarks in the country. So I think that's something we could definitely talk about. Now, I want to come to Fouad. Fouad's very much in my sphere in terms of the aviation side of things. So one second. So what I would like to ask you, Fouad, obviously as regional manager for Emirates, you've been 25 years on the continent, working around the continent. As an international partner of South Africa, bringing a huge number of international tourists into the country, we talked about this, Michael touched on it at the beginning, and we talked about this a lot on Thursday. The widely held belief is the first market to recover post-COVID is going to be domestic. So as an airline, obviously very much an international airline, how do you build that confidence? Michael talked about confidence being something that underpins all of this. So what's Emirates' plan to rebuild confidence in flying again and sitting close to somebody on an aircraft?
Morning again, John and everybody else. Thanks for the opportunity again. Well, I will say one thing, John. You know what? For an industry that is, and I know that from being very close to every other borderlines that we get involved into, for an industry that is very close to fine-tuning, planning, everything is a plan, everything is a template, and everything is an operating manual or booked on an operating manual. Well, this is something that, well, I'll be commonplace saying is totally unexpected, but something that we have no template against. Now, that said, and it's not only because of the symbiotic relationship between tourism and the aviation industry, the 50% passenger numbers that are made up, that make up our seat factors, but I think that tourism as well as aviation are very resilient. I mean, we've seen, I'm old enough to remember, the 98 crisis, the September 2001, the 2008 to 2010 depression, and the issue being that tourism is the first industry to curb, you know, under the storm, but also one of the first to stand back. I think that the analogy about you know, domestic sector leading the way, you know, is a bit played up by the early signs that we're seeing happening out of China. You know, as soon as the Wuhan lockdown was lifted, and then the other cities, you know, started introducing domestic flights. You know, we started picking up a 40% seat factor, global aviation, you know, which is now leading into the 60-65% seat factor. Those are obviously good news. But we also got to remember, you know, that this is based on about, what, 500,000 flight cancellations, you know, for the pipeline in the Chinese network itself. And all said, you know, is that markets are different. Markets will be different. The Chinese market is the second biggest domestic market on the planet after the US. So stands to reason that when the business gets back on its knees and eventually starts standing back, you know, that there will be a lead in or a lead set by you know, the domestic markets. People will have to go back to work. Commuting is a fact of common workplace over there in these countries. People leave remote, you know, provincial, but work urban, you know, and so on, which are factors that we don't necessarily see. I'm not trying to dampen, you know, any expectations, but those are factors that we don't really see in the South African context. But truth and reality shows, and again, I'm not, you know, diminishing the importance of a local tourism network itself, the domestic tourism, you know, setup, structure, infrastructure, which it of and by itself is world-class, one of the most important ones on the continent, as well as can feature, you know, a standing ground, you know, globally. But at the same time, we also need to look at average contributions by head, and the domestic sector is not the one that is, in all reason, the most contributive. Then hard facts. This market is to a minimum 10 to 12 flying hours away from its main source markets, whether they are corporate, whether they are supplier markets, whether they are buyer markets for that matter, for South African manufacturing, South African mining, you know, raw materials and so on, as well as the tourism market. So we'll have to be informed by those facts. How do we envisage things? Obviously, this is where common sense, as well as you know, a hard view of what's happening now, you know, relates to the situation as we see it. And well, as you know, John and everyone else, you know, I mean, Dubai was you know, the biggest airport last year by passenger throughput at above 60 million. We got at the moment a lot of real estate which should have been in the air, sitting on ground, about 225 planes, all wide bodies. So we got, like Sisa as well, you know, and his team, we got a lot of horses in that race. How do we get back things working? Again, common sense. We look at, we will be doing what we do best. We'll be hunting for opportunities. We'll be looking at markets. We will also try to be cautiously optimistic. We've interiorized the fact of hard lockdowns. The one that says that the longer the lockdown and the harder it is, the shorter the takeoff or the relaunch time later. And we've at Emirates, we've, as you know, grounded the fleet until the 30th of June. Doesn't mean that we will not be back early, but we could also be back later. But the fact is that, you know, the fleet lockdown, if we want to use that word, is interiorized until 30th of June. Now, what does it mean in the granular reality of our operations? To start with, nothing can be done without borders reopening. So this is the first factor that we'll have to look for and look at. At the moment, we also started, reviewing those very limited, very intrinsically, short conditions, but we restarted some flights, over to, for instance, Tunis, Algiers, Jakarta, Chicago, for instance, on the basis of third and fourth freedom markets, people working in the UAE, the workforce in the UAE as well as the workforce in the US, in Jakarta, in Pakistan, and so on, who have to commute, get back to work and get back from work. And we started limited. I'm not talking of daily or even close to double daily frequencies. We are looking at basically 1, 2, or 3 flights per week to these destinations. On the granular effect, what is also being reviewed is the fact that, once flows start working, and there are organic natural flows around the world, we'll have to be prepared for those conditions. One of them that you know very well, John, is, for instance, the Australia to UK flow. It's intrinsically VFR, it's purely built on VFR, visiting finance relatives, and it's one of those flows that are year in, year out, they have to happen. It's a little bit like our South Africa to UK flow, or the South Africa to China flow, which then is built around corporate markets. So I will not necessarily put the money on a domestic resurgence. It will happen, but a domestic resurgence that keeps all our necks out of the water. But we will have to start looking at where lead-ins happen, and that would be different per market, corporate to China, VFR to other markets, and so on, which then starts turning the tourism propellers. I can leave some other analogies for later, but for instance, when we look at in a way it's a blessing in disguise, when we look at a South Africa tourism production of $10 billion, which makes it the first market in Africa, but compared to the total tourism, global tourism picture of $2.9 or $3 trillion, I think it's a blessing in disguise that we are not yet overexposed negatively. We'll have to wait for the lead-ins. Those lead-ins will happen. I have voted, when you put the template out, for a resurgence in Q4, and I think that this is what is going to happen. We'll start seeing the VFR and the corporate flows moving business around, putting the planes back in the air, and once the planes are back in the air, the tourism product to follow. We can discuss a little bit more about what will make that tourism product a bit different, but I think that's my conviction for this year.
Yeah, I think again, Michael said it early on. There's pent up demand, and the question is, is that going to be a flood when things start to relax? But I think what we're seeing is that these relaxation is happening at different speeds in different parts of the world. And one of the things that I will get the panel's ideas on here is obviously China as a first source market to recover, because it was the first to be impacted. Is it a place to go? But I want to bring Stephan into the conversation. So Stephan's a serial entrepreneur. He's based down there in Cape Town. Travelstart is an online travel agency that he founded in Sweden back in 1999. Now, it very much focuses on frontier and emerging markets. But what I wanted to get from your side, Stephan, in terms of technology, and we talked about virtual experiences and things like that. It's obviously something you work in. So is that something small businesses should be looking at right now to try and navigate the current turbulence and invest in for this kind of new future that we're expecting?
Yeah, thanks, John. Very good question, of course. And, there's been a lot of, talk so far in this webinar here about, the virus and what the various companies are doing around that and the safety. And so I'm not gonna dwell on that. And I'm also not going to dwell on what all the experts out there in the world are saying, because if we listen to all the experts out there, we might as well just take drugs instead, because they're sort of pointing in all various directions. So I think we need to actually start to apply a little bit more wisdom here on what's going on. So I said to my colleagues very early on, when this whole pandemic started, that I think we're going to have to go back to World War I or World War II to find some sort of similar scenarios on what died and what emerged instead. And I think already now what we can see is that, you know, what was going to happen over the next 5 years, that's going to happen over the next, 5 months, most likely instead. So people are going to, I mean, just look at the fact that we're now using Zoom here, and we've got 1,917 people, listening in here. And normally, people would pay entrance fees to go to a conference, and spending 1 or 2 days away from the office, and checking in at a hotel, that would cost them tons of money just to go to that conference, and losing money not being at work. So this is one way how the worlds are going to change, and then you just apply that sort of in every factor of life that you can think about. Where else are we going to see like a Zoom factor, if you want to call it that, in our everyday lives, in our businesses? And then of course your brain melts down, because there is so much that's going to change, of course, and technology is going to of course change all that stuff, and I think we already know that. So the question is just what factors. I would rather put it like this, because if I look at the chats here and I see what kind of businesses that are listening in here, it's a lot of smaller companies, and I would rather say, I would rather encourage people to think about, if you run a small business, saying, what is it that I do that technology cannot do, and where can I add value there? And because I mean, obviously big companies like Airbnb and Uber and Expedia, etc., and to some degrees ourselves, we are going to solve a lot more problems with technology. So I can just say, from our point of view, our experience from this whole thing is, our company completely tanked because of all the all the customer requests that we started to have. People wanted to change their flights. We changed their flights. And then, the airlines, they canceled those flights, and, they were being told that they could get a refund. Then they were being told that, sorry, you can't get a refund. You can only rebook for later, and you can maybe get a voucher if you're kind. And so we're in the midst of this whole chaos. And so our business just sort of imploded. I mean, thank God we're finally starting to get on top of it now. And now we finally have processes. We've built technology to service all these customers, to help them with all these things. But we realized, okay, there's no way that we can build a company that's going to last for the next 10 years if we rely on manual labor. Because I mean, these things happen every now and then. Last time we had something of this magnitude was when we had the ash cloud. It's 10 years ago, I think. And so that was basically the same thing. It was just an Armageddon, when it comes to customer service issues. So I think it's two things, everything that you can digitize, you have to digitize that, and you have to do it very, very quickly, and just put, all the money that you can on that. The last thing you want to let go is of the engineers, the great brains that can figure that out. And then for smaller businesses that can't afford to build technology, is more thinking about, what is it that technology cannot disrupt in my business? So I think it's more around that, if that sort of, answers a little bit your question there.
No, it does. And I think that's a great point. What is it in my business that technology can't disrupt? Because technology, by its very nature, is disruptive. It's brought in to solve a problem a perceived problem. So, is it that amazing customer service, that physical experience? And obviously you talked about Zoom meetings and this kind of thing taking over. As a conference organizer myself, obviously I hope that isn't the case. And I think, again, similar to Michael's point, there's a pent up demand. We can have virtual experiences. that might make us even more hungry and thirsty for the real thing. You know, we're human beings and we want interaction. Yes, there's a cost that comes with that. And that's something definitely to discuss. So thank you for that, Stephan. Now I want to bring in David Ryan, our last but not least, our final panelist, who's the CEO and founder of Rhino Africa. This is an African inbound tour operator covering both Southern and East Africa. He's in an amazing spot at the moment, so I'd like for him to tell us where he is today. But David's written a really excellent blog and he's provided his thoughts. And this is another thing that comes back to, again, what Michael's talked about, what Sisa's talked about, what Fouad's talked about, which is very much building confidence. So one of the items that I picked up on in the article is that you feel that the booking to travel lead times will actually increase. So is this purely down to confidence? And what else would you say about that subject?
Afternoon, John. Thank you. Well, let me first of all just put into context, Rhino Africa, when we talk about lead times, we represent the B2C market. We're a high-end FIT travel company, tour operator, which means we deal with couples, we deal with small family groups and small groups. So we really focused on tailor-made itineraries, which are African safari based. So it is a small niche sort of sect of the global tourism ecosystem that we're talking about today. So when I talk about lead times, I talk about lead times very specific to this market. And if you have a look at pre-COVID, our lead times were sitting at about 180 days, which is about 6 months that we take to connect a guest to a destination in Africa. Now, that's also largely because of availability and the seasonality of various destinations across sub-Saharan Africa. But if I look at what we're witnessing at the moment and using, so what we're doing at the moment is all our guests that sort of were due to travel sort of March, April, May, we had to postpone. We're now moving into the space of June, July, we're having to postpone. And if we have a look at what guests and what guest behavior is doing is they're all pushing out their travel for about a year. So everybody's pushing out the travel, which could be psychological, that everybody believes that within a year, COVID-19 would have normalized and it'll be safe to travel and borders would have been open again. If you also have a look at what we would have been booking at this time of the year, it would have been for late 2020 into early 2021. Now, we truly believe that travel will come back, and we do believe that there will be a pent-up demand. Because we believe the desire for people to connect and for the desire for people to experience things together is a human trait. So I think technology will take a huge place in where humanity goes in future, but the raw desire to connect and the raw desire to experience things will stay. And Africa, of course, has that in abundance. The other thing we're witnessing is that, which a couple of people have alluded to, is that travel back to Africa, particularly from our primary or our traditional source markets, is going to be entirely dependent on how international borders reopen. And one cannot believe that we are putting ourselves through such severe lockdowns and the economic consequences of that for borders to simply just be opened because we need trade to return, particularly when most of our traditional source markets are still seeing exponential growth in COVID cases. So I think if you go back to psychology, if you go back to the desire that people want to travel, and the desire for travel will be much greater than actually see, and will come much faster than you will actually see bums in seats or bums in beds as people look for certainty. What we're starting to witness just by what we're seeing now in postponements is that 180 days, 6 months is being pushed out to a year. So I think until certainty starts to return to the market, until normalization of flights returns to the market, until people understand that they are going to how they're going to travel if this pandemic is either contained or if it isn't contained but it is treatable, are all factors on how we will build a recovery plan and when we will actually see bums back in the destination, back in our beds, back in our seats. but I don't think it removes the desire for people to want to book and plan. And psychologically, what we're seeing is people are looking at this and going, oh, this is going to take at least a year to be safe in order to start to plan long-haul, high-end destinations specifically.
Yeah, people want security and surety with what they're making a decision to, and any time that you don't have that, it paralyzes decision making, or at least it lends people to be much more conservative with their lead times and their time frame. So I want to get on to, like, you know, what are the opportunities that exist right now, because ultimately we're here to drive the recovery plan. So I want to come to you again, Michael, and just ask you about the opportunity that obviously the currency situation offers to make South Africa a particularly attractive destination for international tourists at the current time.
Thanks, John. When it comes to currency, I think there are two areas, obviously, of opportunity, both international and domestic. So currency works both ways for us to our advantage. From an international perspective, obviously, the rates at the moment and probably for the foreseeable future in the next 6 to 12 months, although I'd never bet one way or another against the rand in a long-term basis, but certainly now is very positive, and we are seeing our clients out there at the moment selling South Africa ahead based upon those rates. So we are currently seeing interest and marketing taking place around the world to take advantage of the rates as they are at the moment. On the other side, we do believe that domestic market is important, and not so much because we think it's a great market for us, but because this is about our industry surviving. And we need to do whatever we can to fulfill jobs to people across the country or in our industry. So any way we can fill it to survive in all our different suppliers is critical in the short term. Long term, when the market comes back, the inbound, that's obviously going to highlight be different. But so currency wise, locally does make it easier for us to sell South Africa, both under the great leadership we've had of our president, tourism minister, SA Tourism, and this industry and our people have really come together in an amazing way. A rainbow moment where everybody's come together, and I think the leadership, we all agree, I don't want to restate what we all know, has been an example to the world, the empathy, inspiration of taking tough decisions and communicating so well with everybody across the board that I think it's going to help us tremendously to sell, buy South African across the board, buy and tour South Africa and support South Africa. And so it becomes, even though our suppliers will need to come to the market with prices that can match local demand, it is critical to get through this period. This is all about timing and how we deal with this timing. We know at the end we're going to get there, but in the timing perspective, the currency helps us both ways. And to those who are thinking of speculating at the moment in the currency, I would just say to you that you have more than enough battles to fight at the moment, so maybe that's one more battle you don't really want to take on at this time. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much for the contributions and conversations. And I've been both listening and also trying to read some of on the chat side and some questions. I'm just going to give some views on some of the questions that have been coming through. I think the first one I'd like to highlight here is from Martin Jensen van Vuren. We need a clear picture of what South Africa will look like after lockdown ends, from, as per the experts of Professor Salim Karim, the chairperson of the Health Ministers' COVID Forum Advisory Groups. The question is here, what is the panel's opinion on whether domestic travel will resume while infection rates are rising again? And I think Michael touched on that right now in terms of the domestic travel. the caveat that I'd like to add in there, I think what's becoming very clear is that our recovery is actually a subset of SA Inc.'s view as to how we can come out of this pandemic that we're in. If there was any doubt right now, is that the Department of Health, through the Minister of Health, is essentially driving and having the ear of the president as to when the recoveries come place. Now, what came through yesterday as well is that we had a hard lockdown. A date was set, lockdown, everything is finalized then. But I got a sense yesterday, last night, is that coming out of the lockdown, it's not going to be a hard one, but rather sequenced out, right? We just don't know the details and the timelines on that sequencing out. And that has a direct impact on our sector as to how we can plan ourselves basically out of the space. The question I'd like to throw to the panel, and happy that anyone comes in, is that fundamentally the business principles hold true in any sector, right? And the question that I want to throw to them is that the customer or the consumer is ultimately the decider. What does tomorrow's consumer look like in a post-COVID environment? Can we assume that their needs and wants are still exactly the same as pre the pandemic? If not, what do they look like? What are the things that they are looking for? Because having that view will actually help the sector, even ourselves, to say, well, how do we position ourselves in order to meet the requirements and needs of the new age tourism traveler? It's an open question to anyone that can jump in.
Okay, so who fancies taking that one? Stephan, over to you, sir.
Yeah, so I've been obviously thinking a lot about this, and I think the last thing I want to do is give my colleagues or my customers or my fellow entrepreneurs a sort of false hope that things will bounce back and things will go back to normalcy, etc. I think that would be only partially true. So depending on how long this will last, the consequences will be bigger and bigger. So I've thought about a lot about other big events in my life, and I thought about this weekend here. So I was a very popular DJ in the clubs in Sweden in the 80s, and in the mid 80s the whole HIV spread like wildfire around the world, and we could see that in our clubs that less and less people came, and it started to change a lot. But then I remember this weekend that in New York, the whole social life actually changed during this HIV and AIDS crisis, and was that people actually stopped, sleeping around as much as they used to. And in New York, it was a place where people, thrived on sleeping around with new partners all the time. And so what they started to do, and I remember this article in New York Times, that what happened was people started to go having to have dinners instead. And actually, as I studied this, that was actually the start of the fine dining culture as we know it today. That didn't exist in the past. I mean, there were nice restaurants, but not these sort of arty type of culinary experiences. And that actually was a result from people, being more restricted in their sexual life. And I think that this is sort of what we need to look for now, is that what will people do instead? Because sure as hell, people are not going to travel as much as they did in the past, and they're going to travel differently. They're going to look for other experiences, absolutely. And I think that I'm not from South Africa, but I live here since 15 years. My primary concerns is jobs in this country. And this is what I think we should talk about here. How do we preserve jobs? How do we create new jobs? And there's lots there that we can do. Holding on to the old stuff, I think, would be completely wrong at this stage, because it's going to take a long time before we see numbers being what they used to be. And I think we're blessed in that sense that we have such an incredible country. So there's so much stuff here we can do, and everything is of the greatest quality we can find in the world. And this is really where I think we as an industry need to, really come up with great ideas where we can, encourage each other to launch new types of, businesses.
Amazing. Yeah, thank you. And absolutely, it always helps when you've got a fantastic tourism product and a really varied tourism product on your doorstep as well. Velma would like to make an intervention. So over to you, Velma. I will just unmute you. There we go. Okay.
Okay, I think I'm unmuted now. Yeah, so I think, just a few things to say, on the recovery. And with a massive caveat that, my guess is as good as anyone's, but, I think based on, what some of the experts have said, and, as Stephan said earlier, a lot of it, not necessarily all of the experts agree, but, I think some of the things that we will see around recovery is that we're most likely going to see an uneven recovery. There's not going to be sort of one overall signal that says that tourism is going to recover. It might start recovering in China a little bit before, in other places. And that's quite different to some of the crises that have come before. So for example, the ash cloud, there was there was an even recovery kind of coming out of that, the financial crisis and so forth. And then I think the second thing is that I think people will be tentative because we're also quite likely to start to see a W-shaped recovery. So we may start to see that things do start to recover. Maybe some sort of domestic and local travel will come back. Maybe some borders will open. But then, there is also talks that sort of as Europe goes back into winter, the virus may, peak again, and that there will be once again in sort of a situation where there is kind of lockdown and borders. So I think recovery is probably going to be relatively tentative. And so if we think about what that means for traveler behavior, I think there's two things to take into consideration. One is what we're likely to see in the nearer term, and then what is in the longer term. And I think in the nearer term is probably more relevant, but we will, it's very likely that we'll start to see more local travel, a lot more hyper-local travel. So where can people go within 3 hours of their home so that they don't have to get onto a plane? We're probably going to see, and I think this is different to what David had referenced with the kind of bookings that he's seeing, which is, people who are really much planning a trip, they're coming internationally. But I think with local travel, we're probably likely to see shorter booking windows, people wanting to have flexible cancellation policies, and very much kind of focused on value for money. And then I think, in the longer term, it's going to be really, really interesting, as Stephan said, to see, what are some of the trends that are going to come out of this. I think that some speculation is also that, that's very much kind of a focus on kind of sustainable travel. I think one thing that, COVID has done for the advocates of climate change is that governments will never again be able to say that certain things are not possible. And so, the way in which the world responds to kind of climate change may be very, very different into the future.
Yeah, some great points. So, David, I want to come to you. I know you wanted to say something, but do you agree with Stephan that tomorrow's traveller will be somebody who's looking for a unique experience, who's going to travel less?
I'm not sure they're going to travel less. And if I use the financial crisis of 2009 as an example, what we saw was people traveled for longer. They did less number of holidays a year, but they traveled for longer in the holidays that they did. I think and if we look at an African or a South African recovery here, one of the things we must take into consideration is if we look at the psychology of people, and one of the psychologies might be an aversion to crowded places or mass tourism. And if you look at Africa from that perspective, we offer a hugely unique opportunity here because we are largely what we would determine an under-tourism destination. In other words, low number of footprints for the wildlife spaces and the experiences that we have on offer. And that could be a unique selling point. So I think if we look at it, I think there could be some great tailwinds for our recovery. And I refer back to like what Michael was saying about exchange rates. If we work with purpose as an industry to make sure that we don't get rate increases, that we make sure that our destination remains competitive. If we have a look at, I'm not as optimistic as about domestic travel as what my colleagues are. And the reason for that is I believe our economy has taken severe pain through these lockdowns, and that we have not had anything close to the financial stimulus and packages that Europe, the UK, and US are having. And that even plays to our tailwinds, because I believe a lot of our potential guests or long-haul guests into sub-Saharan Africa are actually going to have more disposable income coming out of COVID-19 than they have coming into COVID-19 because of these stimulus packages. But that's not the same for South Africa or Southern Africa. So less optimistic about our own ability within our economy to support domestic travel, because we haven't seen those. But definitely, I think there is going to be a shift. I think clients are going to be looking for experiences. I think one of the other psychology points of lockdown around the world, with a third of the world in lockdown, is that desire for connectedness again. And travel brings connectedness at the end of the day. And I think these all play into tailwinds for a recovery of South Africa and sub-Saharan Africa, but we really do have to work with common purpose as an industry so that we make sure that we can take advantage of all of those tailwinds.
Yeah, definitely. So Fouad, I want to come to you. I wanted to ask you, obviously Velma's talked about short stays, shorter distances to travel. Obviously that's not great for an airline like Emirates. And I wanted to get your feelings on that, but also what about corporate travel? What's the prediction from that side? Is this going to suffice, or are people, are you expecting a big pickup on the corporate side?
John, the definition of a segment will be critical as to how we apply, the idea of a recovery in future. But I would just like to rebound on what Michael mentioned and Stephan as well, with regards to keeping people in jobs, ensuring that minimum income levels are maintained within the industry at a more granular level. And I think it goes beyond that. I also come from a tourism island as well, and I've experienced tourism products in other parts of Africa. And there's one thing that South Africa has worked very hard with SA Tourism, with lots of friends and colleagues, who spend a lot of time training a lot of kids, into hospitality and tourism products, and so on, and where you have gained a level of competencies which is quite high, very high compared to other African products. We have to be very keen on ensuring that there's no backward slippage. And backward slippage can occur, as I've seen. I'm not going to name the places, because of war, because of social unrest, because of politics, and so on, where hitherto a very good placed tourism products in some countries, in some islands, etc., have slipped back. We have to be very keen, in ensuring that this doesn't happen in this context. Now, with regards to, the maintenance of institutional knowledge and institutional experience and how it will link to that recovery factor, there's something else we need to also be alert to. And I'm sure you, as me, many of my friends, colleagues, have asked you, but Fouad, this is worse than a war. This is the grounding of 17,000 planes globally. This is 60% of the global traffic, parked around the airports. How do we get back of that? I would look at the incremental granular effects, right? Yes, it's bad, and no one is simplifying the issue in any way. But when you review the posits of structural factors themselves, what do you see? The factories are still there and they're not damaged. The assets and resources of productions are still there, they're not damaged. Those planes, yes, they're sitting idle, but they're still there. So I think that the world is capable of a rebound when that rebound happens. Now, how do we get a foot in the saddle? Is that I think we all agree on that. You know, I mean, it will not be the same back on track, the same thrust, you know, from different parts of the world in the same magnitudes and in the same volumes. For a fact, you know, we will probably see a return, you know, to last year's, which was a very good year, tourism figures, probably in the next 2 or 3 years. But I think the machine is keen to be relaunched. Now, on our local level, on our local scale, there's one issue, and that's the issue that informs, for instance, within many other things, that informs where do we put our budgets, how do we engage you know, our marketing, our expenditure, our communications, you know, and so on. And it's an issue of methodology, and it's an issue of demographics. Well, demographics first, and very sadly, we will probably not see our 65 to 75 year old empty nesters or that kind of a demographic or that kind of a segment for some time. We'll probably have to convince them, you know, that if you know, a cruise ship where you would imagine you would be in the safest of conditions is not the safest place, then how to get on a plane, how to get into a hotel, how to, you know, get involved with, you know, in places that are very foreign and alien, you know, than from a home environment will be safer. So that will take time. So on the other hand, however, I'm not saying that this is good by any chance, right? But what I'm saying is that you have, as Michael referred to, a pent-up demand of 25 to 45-year-olds, you know, who are, I'm not saying that they're virus-free, but they're a little bit less touched. They have a disposable income, they have a keenness to travel, and those means or resources of travel are available. We'll probably need to review our methodology, for instance, Sisa, you know, the one that picks up, you know, tourist arrivals by country of nationality. In the world of today, Velma and Stephan know exactly what I'm talking about. This is a falsehood. You probably have more American passport, US passport holders living in the Middle East today who have visited South Africa than US passport holders from the US, you know, who have traveled to the African continent. So maybe the view and the dispersion of your offices around the world, around the globe, should probably be more tuned to segmented markets than to geographies. So that's one view of things. Then I can only share, you know, what we have seen over the last 2 or 3 months, where there has been a very steep increase on online communications, on social media, on you know, on social media contact, you know, to start with, about the view of refunds and travel vouchers, you know, and so on. But there has been a very strong increase in social media communications. I think that's one of the places where airlines are going to invest a bit more, would be around, very much so like our friends from the OTA and the Airbnb do, you know, would be on increasing, maybe wetting our feet a bit more and increasing brand equity on social media, because that's that interaction that goes directly in the face of those 25 to 45-year-old segments who are keen to travel. More interaction online, obviously not negating, you know, the offline, the more direct to office, the more bricks and mortar connections, but more online interaction, more probably, of course, with due respect of laws and legislation, but probably more fine-tuned interaction about people preferences, travel taste. Well, there's already a whole body of work that goes into that. But for instance, what gets somebody on a plane and what gets somebody into South Africa? Maybe more scanning of Facebook platforms, Facebook trends, more analytics. I mean, there are trends that are to stay. Those are some of them. What will probably inform airline direction in the future as well, because it also behaves in a direction of cost of sales, where we will probably look at reforming the B2B environment, which is a costly environment. I'm thinking of, for instance, distribution costs, and so on, where I can see the marketplace changing. Talking, I mean, I'm not bringing in something that is specific to Emirates, but that everyone can relate to. Where a segment costing $10 to $12, is prohibitive on a flight down to South Africa and back from our source markets. But I can see more aggressive interaction in a direct B2C environment. And this is where, that whole chain, the whole supply and value chain that involves us, our trade partners, our suppliers, and so on, will probably work closely on. And my last view on a resurgence is maybe a very simplistic analogy, but it's about what? What are we witnessing? The first live streaming, real-time media pandemic. I mean, the death rate, the morbidity rate, the recovery rates, etc., is streaming out live in front of our faces. What does it impute? Is that this is a trend that will remain, whether it is today, whether it is in a future travel sense. And how do we, and I think it's a saddle being offered for us to use. And what do we do? I'm not there to lecture Sisa, but I think that, in broader environments, we need to be one of these places, that is constantly featured in the media, and the global media. I don't know, I'll share an example, I mean, Kenya tourism was known for what David described as high-end marketing on Amboseli, the Masai Mara, and so on. And one little thing happened in, I think, the year 2000 that changed the perspective. And that was one Survivor episode run that took place in the Mara. But it did one thing. It put Kenya tourism and the elephants and the Big Five and everything else squarely in the face of the American audience. And since then, you have had, a normal natural flow that has operated. I'm thinking of things like Amazing Race. I'm thinking of programs, that put us, into, the global merchandising mechanism that is not only built on, expos and exhibitions and, and B2B marketing. I think we have to go B2C, and I think we have to go B2C using any platform available, including this one. Thank you.
Thank you, Fouad, and thank you for your thoughts there. Certainly quite a bit there. I think the key takeaways in terms of better segmenting our customers. I think the age demographic is a very important one, as the older, who actually happen to be more affluent, will be less keen to travel because they're more at risk. Just on that thread there, it is said that health safety rather is the new personal safety, so therefore people want to be assured it's no longer just the crime prevention, but now it's just about the basic health side. A question was posed by Peter and Patrick around visas and relaxation of visas. And I've just got a thought that I want to put out there and kind of want to hear for any of the panels as well, is that there's definitely a view that says relax visas in order to stimulate and make it easier for people to come to South Africa. Now, balance that off to me with the environment that we are in, where we've seen, even in Europe, borders have come up now. So there isn't a free-flowing Schengen area, right? So therefore, do we see the borders coming down in those source markets? And secondly, I think the permanent feature, can you imagine what a visa application looks like to anywhere in the world? And you can imagine the brand new question that'll be asked in terms of where have you been, what symptoms are you showing, et cetera, et cetera. So do you almost see like almost as part of your identity as a person is no longer just going to be asking, can you afford to come here? Do you have a hotel booked, a flight booked? But also more about your health and hygiene as an example. So instead of visas being removed, do we not globally seeing more visas coming up with the key question to filter out those that may pose a danger into any markets around the world? Again, just an open question for anyone who wants to answer that.
Let me come to Michael for that one. He's had his hand up. So over to you, Michael.
Sure. Thank you. Thanks, Sisa. Well, when it comes to visas and what people expect, we want them to come to this country. We're going to be competing against a myriad of destinations. And whilst we've seen borders raised at this particular time, let's remember this is a major crisis. And if I go back to a crisis at the start of the lockdown, I would bet that there's nobody here, this is just a bet, in this panel and attending, that would have said what happened 2 weeks later is in fact what happened in terms of the numbers and the curve, etc. So that just shows in a space of 2 weeks how our predictions in a major crisis like this can chop and change, and is likely to. So I think in a situation like this, the more you can delay, which is what the curve, what the lockdown is doing, the more opportunity you can set your sails for what is going to occur in the future. And so as time goes on, whether it's May, whether it's June, we'll have a much better view as to what we need to do around visas and how to go forward. But what we do know is we're going to be competing against destinations. And we know that health and safety is key. We know, as David said, that this is a fantastic country to visit in terms of space at this time. We know that technology can assist us, as Stephan said. And if you look at some of the technology coming out on tracing, using technology to trace people's phones, which is now coming out for the first time, being able to trace if you are sick, what happened, and if we can apply these things, they can make it easier to gain confidence and control for people to come on the airlines, which is the most critical part of getting back to where we are. As Fouad said, everything is still there. So if we look at our visas and we come back to the foundations of tourism and the discussions that we've had, I think they're more pronounced now than ever before. That in fact, e-visas is critical to make it easy, not harder for people to come here than elsewhere. I think that health and safety on people's mind is not just the changes we need to make around gaining psychological confidence and ensuring that our products are adapted for health and safety throughout the chain, but also crime has been a serious problem for us, and the industry and the government have been working closely on it, and progress has been made and more progress needs to be made. And this, I think, is going to be something we have to ensure that when we get back up does not shoot us in the foot, and that we do everything we can to make sure that we can give peace of mind to where our tourists are going, where they're coming, and to have a safe trip, because I think it's going to be front of mind when we do get back. Thanks.
Yeah, absolutely. And from the aviation standpoint and the access side of things, I mean, I know that there will be companies working on sort of non-invasive ways to track and trace people and check their temperatures through the airport, so that hopefully the experience won't be massively compromised and you'll feel, hugely like it's not a pleasant experience to travel. But of course, those things will be being thought of, you know, as we speak now. So I'm conscious of time. We've only got 5 minutes left. So I'd just like to come to all of you for your sort of final remarks. So if I can start with you, David, just something that you think we should be focused on now to actually go into this recovery plan that we're formulating at the moment.
I think the main thing most of us can do as individuals and businesses is focus on how we survive it and take a view. If we're listening to what the experts are saying, and we're looking at when recovery is looking, whether it's in a 3 to 6 or a 6 to 12 month period, is to individually look at how you can hibernate, how you can reduce cost structures, and how we can, as a business and an industry, first survive it, and then make sure we have enough ability to capitalize it on the other side.
Yeah, great point. You know, we talked about that a lot on Thursday in terms of conserving cash and obviously being able to survive. So, Stephan, over to you, sir, for your closing remarks.
Yeah, so I would agree with David completely. Everything that he said about, you know, trying to stay alive, you know, preserving cash. But I would probably also add to that is actually taking a good hard look at what is it going to look like, you know, post-COVID. You know, how do you gear your business up for the next 10 years? Because it's not going to be business as usual. And you know, luckily in South Africa, I think that, you know, we have, you know, if the president is wise here now, he will use this opportunity to basically, you know, completely reboot the country and you know, get rid of all the legacy that's there. That because we have so many things. You know, I'll just give you one small example. There was this thing called that you need to bring an unabridged birth certificate when as you were entering the country or getting out of the country. I still to this day still don't know if that is in effect or not. So if I check up, it's not in effect. But when you check in at an airport in Frankfurt or Munich or London, and you have a kid with you, they will ask for that unabridged birth certificate, and you know, you won't get on the plane unless you have it, because nobody's updated. That's just one of those tiny things and this country is full of all these, you know, weird administrative things that is just, you know, holding our businesses back. And at the end of the day, I think, you know, it's about the jobs and it's about the economy, because if we don't create jobs, you know, people won't be able to travel anyway. So I think, you know, us as business leaders here and everybody that's listening in here, you know, it's our duty to try to create jobs, you know, and that's really very important.
Yeah, absolutely. Any barrier to entry is going to, you know, not going to help you win that custom. I completely agree with that. And I think that, you know, the words that we were using a lot in on Thursday are sort of reset and reinvent. And that is, like you say, it's an opportunity now for the country to do that. So Velma, I'd like to come to you next. I think I'm having a problem with unmuting you. There you go.
Yeah, so I think just in closing, I mean, I want to echo, you know, what both David and Stephan have said, is that I think, you know, in this time, you know, we need to recognize that, you know, emerging economies like ourselves are the most vulnerable, also because we don't have the kind of deep pockets that other economies have. And so, you know, making sure that like businesses that we can come through this kind of crisis is key. But then, you know, I think as we come through it, we're into a whole new kind of playing field. And then it is really about kind of trying to identify the new opportunities, people coming together. Collaboration is actually going to be key for the destination, and really, really kind of finding kind of creativity. And I think, you know, when we look back on this period, we will see that there will be a lot of, you know, very exciting things born out of it. You know, a company like Airbnb was born in a crisis. We came out of the, you know, 2008 kind of financial crisis. And this is, you know, probably the opportunity where many more, you know, other Airbnbs will be born.
so many companies did. If you look at WhatsApp and companies like that, they came through these periods of disruption. And I think ultimately we have to be optimistic as travel professionals, because if we're not, then we can't expect the customers to be either. So just want to come quickly to you, Fouad, just for your final remarks.
Yeah, John, I remain deeply optimistic, and for a few reasons. One of them is that there's no walk back from globalization. Whether it's a good or bad factor, it's not for me to judge, but I think it's here to stay. One of the examples I have is that, the day before the lockdown, the day before we suspended our flights, there were, I still remember, 12 South African nationals traveling to Phuket on our morning departing flight. We had all the pains in the world to try to get them back later, but, I think we are an adventurous people. I think we'll still travel. It's in the genes, it's in the DNA. It's what brought everybody down here to that little piece of rock, at the end of the continent. And I think that is valid for both inbound and outbound. To the other thing as well, I think that the milestones have been led by the president last year in his State of the Nation address, reflecting on the 7.8 million inbound numbers to South Africa and setting the goal for 21 million by 2025. I think that this is a unique opportunity to, like you said, reset, reboot, but also use all the implements and the time, especially time, that has been given to us now to make the product better from a granular level, ensure that the institutional knowledge, experience, expertise is maintained from the superb managers of our 5-star properties in South Africa, our resorts, and so on, down to the waiter in the restaurants. There's a reason why Tasha's, if I use the name, have opened an outlet in Dubai, or Ocean Basket is a name, or Nando's is visible on every street corner in London. There's a reason for that. So it's those things that we should be able to work on and probably better and tune in. And I think we'll have a better rebound than what we are even expecting.
Fantastic. Thank you. So Michael, 60 seconds just to give us your closing remarks.
Thanks, John. I agree with everything that's been said. I would just add that I think the next 6 months is going to be critical, a period of survival. And it is best to be optimistic as we are and as a lot of people are, but also to be able to adjust your sails, whatever happens, to still remain and remember to be empathetic to the situation, to our partners, the people we work with, because ultimately we all survive together. So I don't really believe it is hold on cash at all costs. There has to be a midway in scenarios to help others where you need to and where you can. So really to do the best for our staff and our partners in very choppy waters, hope the best that actually we are going to see an optimistic start in May, June. But if it goes the other way, be prepared for it and do so in a way that we can all be proud how we acted together over this period. Thanks, John.
Thank you, and keep communicating, I think, is the other point. Keep using, keep everybody informed as to what you're doing, and that's why it's such a great platform to be able to have this. So, Sisa, over to you just to wrap us up, and then I'll tell everybody about Thursday.
Thank you very much, and thank you very much again for all the contributions from the panelists, and also thank you for the participants in terms of the questions that are coming through. And I really take to heart a lot of the suggestions that have been coming through. I think in the end, as the tourism board, we essentially make promises and create a desire for people to either travel within South Africa or to South Africa. We are, however, relying on yourselves, the private sector, to fulfill those promises. A gap between the two becomes a problem. And I think this is where the collaboration between the two sides is important. It's time to hit the reset button so that we can all drive the recovery together. And we need to be in sync. Otherwise, we may be looking in different sides of the same picture in itself. And I want to thank everybody for their contribution, and the conversation is still ongoing. And till next time. And again, we'll be taking through all these questions and all these inputs and compiling them so that there's continuity on that front. Thank you.
Fantastic. So final thing for everybody who's still with us, I see there's still over 1,500 people. There will be another webinar, the third one, the last one in this series, on Thursday. We don't have the panel yet, but it will be at the same time. So we'll, on the follow-up email, you'll have the YouTube video so you can watch this back and share it with your network. And you will then also get the registration link to register for Thursday's webinar. So I just want to say a massive thank you to all of the panel. Thank you to all of our attendees. I see there's over 140 questions on the Q&A. We will go through all of those. They will formulate much of what we discuss on Thursday. We've been watching the chat as well. So we are listening. If we haven't been able to get to your particular topic, I'm sure we will. And thank you, everybody, once again. I'll just unmute all the panelists and thank you. We'll see you on Thursday for the next webinar. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Bye.
Thanks, John.
Thank you.
Thanks, Sisa.
Bye-bye.
Cheers.